So I'm Nick Chun. I'm a demographer at the Population Research Center. I manage the Oregon Population Forecast Program. With me here is my colleague Randy Morris at the Portland Institute of Metropolitan Studies. Today what we're going to be going over is the HardtoCount map. I now realize in hindsight the actual description of this breakout session probably wasn't the most detailed. It probably could have been more detailed. We'll be going over the HardtoCount map that PRC created that was funded through CEFCO, and I'll be touching on some of the couple other maps that are available that were mentioned in some previous presentations or panels, particularly the CUNY HTC 2020 map and the Rome map from the Census. So we'll be going over like those three maps. Each one of them has their own strengths and weaknesses, and so it'll be up to the user to judge when it's appropriate to use one over the other. So the first thing I wanted to start out is really differentiating the difference between undercount and HardtoCount. And so this terminology is often used interchangeably. You've probably seen some statistics that are out there where it's some that are talking about like the Asian population in 2010 was undercounted by 46%. It's like that's not true. What it means is that they're hard to count. Now, even though those two terminologies are like very close together, they mean two separate things. And so hard to count means that individuals are less likely to respond by mail in 2010, or in this case by mail or internet. It means that if they're less likely to respond by mail or internet, that makes them more likely to be undercounted, more likely to be missed. And so why is it important to look at the hard to count populations? Well, for those of you who were here in literally any of the other sessions, I'm sure it's been hammered in your head that it's important to look at because disproportionately populations that are hard to count or missed are usually a lot of ethnic and racial minorities. And it costs us more resources to follow up. And so ideally we would want people to just to answer the form the first time because federally the funding, I think Dick, like in a previous interview asked, or in a previous panel asked, is there enough resources to guarantee that there will be enough follow-up, money for follow-up, and I guess the best answer is just to get people to answer the form. So, undercount, again, that means that individuals not counted in the census. In the 2010 post-enumeration survey, it showed that there was practically a 0% net overcount or undercount, so no statistical, it wasn't statistically established that there was a net overcount or undercount. But obviously that varies by racial and ethnic groups. And so blacks were at the nation level, African Americans were undercounted at 2%, renters at 1%, and children at 5%, whereas their counterparts such as white alone, not Hispanic, homeowners, and older populations were overcounted. So in order to, when determining who is hard to count, really there's like this broad framework that really hits on four things. It's people that are hard to locate, and so hard to locate could be for housing units that are not on the grid or that were missed in the LUCA or that were missed when the census was trying to get a master address list. Hard to contact, so hard to contact, that really goes over into maybe highly mobile people who are in RV parks, or in transient locations. Those are hard to locate. Hard to persuade, and so hard to persuade are people who may have low civic engagement or distrustful of government. And then finally you have hard to interview, so this is people who are households that speak a different language that isn't on the census. So obviously these four are not mutually exclusive, hence the Venn diagram that I shamelessly stole but sourced down over there. That shows that a lot of hard to count populations and communities fall within one or really multiple of these themes. And so for the hard to count groups, I'm just going to go, there's children, rural residents, individuals of color, immigrants, and highly mobile persons. This is not the full list. This is probably about the fifth or sixth time that you've heard someone say this, so I won't go into too much more detail on that. But for when we go into the second part of this presentation, when Randy will take over, we're going to show the 2020 HardtoCount map that PRC produced, funded through CEFCO, and this is different from the two other maps that people are familiar with. So there is the CUNY HardtoCount map, which I'm just going to pull up over here. So here's the CUNY HardtoCount map. So what this is showing is 2010 mail response rates for the nation. The core pleth areas are the areas that are shaded in color. Those areas represent the bottom quartile, or the bottom 25% of tracts with the lowest response scores at the nation, at the national level. And so I think that was at 73%. And so obviously this is at a national scale, right? When we look at the Rome map, when we look at the Rome map, this is again a national scale that uses a multiple regression model to predict low response scores. So these are not actual response scores. This is a predicted value based off a model. That's very important to remember. The 2010 is the actual rates, the Rome is predicted rates. And that's using a national model. And so what we wanted to do and what we did was we created a statewide map that was using kind of elements from both of these maps, where we used the quartile method to identify hard-to-count locations, but looking at the Oregon average. So instead of 73%, it was 76%. But using more pop-ups and visualizations to make it a little easier to read. And then for the Rome, which was using American Community Survey data at the block, group, or census tract level, which if any of our data users are here, you'll know that that's extremely problematic because of the data reliability. And so the first iteration that we have on the website right now is more like the HardtoCount 2020 map, where it's just showing the historic rates. Ideally, in the near future, we want to add a capability that projects out the expected change, or what the new mail return rate will be, similar to Rome, but using, in my opinion, a more robust methodology for doing so. With that in mind, I will let Randy take over to show you the features of our map, if I can get this going. Excellent.
You're going to let me do it, huh?
Yeah, I'll just let you do it.
Hi there. Like Nick said, my name is Randy Morris. I'm with Portland, IMS, Institute of Portland Metropolitan Studies. I'm the Community GIS project leader there. And they asked me to help visualize some of this interesting data that's coming out from the HardtoCount. And so I'll show you what we came up with and explain some of the rationales for the visualizations, if I can find it in this mess.
Oh, do you just want to go to the actual website?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. All right. Let's just make life easier.
There we go.
So you go to the Census 2020 Now website. It says right here it has its own link, Oregon HDC map. This is the website that's going to have all the presentations up on board, so all the notes.
So I'll do my best to stay out of the way of the map while I describe some of these features. We did our best to make this available at various screen sizes, and these are the kinds of details I would go into in a more cartography-centric presentation. So I'll stick to the functionality wherever I can. We've got general information on the left. It tells you sort of why the map is doing what it's doing and how it's dealing with general information. Most of the actual information comes up or is related through these side panels here. So if you'll just go ahead and click on one of the census tracts. Map is fully zoomable and pannable, as any good online map should be. And if you come in here and click on one of the tracts, what you get is first a reading of the expected, or the 2010 return rate, which is how these were analyzed, whether or not we've identified it as an urban or rural. And then the part that I had the most fun with, to be honest, is the visualization here under HardtoCount indicators. So this is one of the things I really like to try to bring to the table, is drilling down into the data. So it's hard to count, but why is it hard to count? And this is something that Nick and I have been experimenting with in various places. In this case, we have red dots that pop up next to the particular indicator that is in the quartile, right? Yeah, is in the quartile that is indicative of hard to count. So in this case, if there's a high population of children under 5, then that, if it's in the top quartile, then that's going to come up with the dot, and so on and so forth. So a couple of them, I believe, are low quartiles, like it would be
No, they're all
Occupied housing units, isn't it?
yeah.
Okay, so most of them are all high quartile with one low quartile. But those change based on what you click on. So you can get an instant sort of readout of what's going on in that particular census tract. And we're always trying to expand that capability. We did a social vulnerability map with that sort of concept earlier as well. Then, let's see, was there anything else there? Yeah, so if you click on that again.
It's already changed.
Okay, so he clicked on the select feature, and that selects the particular census tract. Then you get a directed layout here that shows you the distribution by race in that particular census tract. Now, this is being sort of compressed because of the screen size. So if you're on a larger screen, all of these labels will show up. But in this case, you have to hover over it to find out what it is. And then, of course, you have a legend here and an explanation of the esoteric descriptions that you find in a lot of these census race and ethnicity breakdowns. So that's one thing I showed this to my wife, and she's like, "What does this mean? What does this mean? What is what is it? AIAN?" Which of course some of us early in my career of dealing with this stuff, I instantly saw Asian. That's what I saw when I looked at that, and I think that's an important thing for us to help clarify with people. So always working on that as well. This also has the capability of doing multi-select, so you can select using that more complex select tool up in the top corner. You can select multiple census tracts. The other thing you can do is, there you go, and it gives you an aggregate. I'm still testing this to make sure it's on the numbers, but so far so good. The other thing you can do, if you clear that, is we've got a couple simple selections and query tools at the top, so you can select by county. Say your census work is going on in Coos County or Baker County or something like that. Automatically selects that county, zooms to it, and then filters all the communities within that county. So you can do a simple visual query and selection, drilling down into particular areas. And obviously this one doesn't come up as one of the choropleth symbolized hard-to-count areas, but you can still get that information, still get the specific information from the census tract relevant to the HTC 2020. So you can do as many of those as you want. I'm trying to think if there's any other functions. No, that's pretty much it. Like Nick said, one of the things we're hoping to do is model the HardtoCount for 2020 and offer that as a second layer or a second map that you can compare with the original one, and then have a better idea of maybe where you're going to have a problem getting those counts.
Yep.
That's my part in this.
So I guess we'll just open up to questions or discussions just about like the HardtoCount population or any of the three maps that was brought up. I may not be an expert in the other two, but I can at least do the best to answer questions about the one that we made at PRC.
I have a question. Thank you. Have you guys thought much about the fact that some of this data could be used to target certain groups or individuals? And what do you guys think about that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. That's actually one of the reasons why that's with all types of data, particularly when it's oriented towards social justice, you run that risk. When you identify populations that are vulnerable, then those are, depending on who is using the data, that information can be used for nefarious purposes. I mean, that's just the reality of working with social science data. I would say that the way that we're trying to mitigate that is by making sure that this information is aggregated no lower than the census tract level for confidentiality reasons. On the Rome data set, I believe they have the data at the block group level, or they modeled some of the estimates at the block group level, which is, again, problematic because of the reliability of those estimates, but also problematic in terms of the kind of like the geographic precision of the unit of analysis. And so it's not the most satisfying answer, but the way that we're trying to, I guess like the way that we're putting a stance on is making sure that the estimates that we produce are at a geographic level that is broad enough where ideally they specific communities at like cross sections or intersections won't be targeted.
There's a question in the back.
Thank you. Can you hear me? My question is, I'm going to piggyback on your concern because we are seeing the rise of racist, the racist groups here in the state, in our city, downtown. They're taking possession of our streets, and so I, as a member of a quote-unquote minority group that is still, that is now 20% of the U.S. population, in Oregon, I'm weary about the specificity of your data. Because we could keep that data, and really reflect who's out there, but I cannot, somehow be safe from being targeted, in my own home. My mother is disabled. How would I know? My friends who are gays, lesbians, trans women, how would I know that they're not going to be targeted? Because, in the pursuit of science, we're trying to get, a true count. But are we giving weapons to people who don't have my own view of my destiny, my life, my security? So I want to make sure. What can you tell us in terms of keeping that privacy and keeping the social net, in place?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and again, this kind of comes back to the double-edged sword of using data-driven decisions, right? On the one hand, if we don't count these populations, if we don't highlight the injustice or the inequities, then those inequities don't exist on a system, they don't see it if that's not measured. On the other hand, by pointing them out, like you said, it can open up and create vulnerabilities and use it in an avenue for various purposes. I will say for the data that we're showing, it's all publicly available. So this is not our responsibility. We don't have the purview to restrict this information. This information is also put out by the Census Bureau. We're actually providing less information than other groups because we don't find that the estimates are reliable or that they're necessarily conceptually valid. And so that's the rigor that we implement, but in terms of the actual information, like someone's like race, ethnicity, or nationality, that information is already out there. One thing for the census is that it doesn't ask the question about orientation. It'll ask about your household relationship. This will be covered more by my director, Dr. Jason Djurdjevic, in the following panel, but it actually goes over household relationships. I know that's kind of a tangent, but I just wanted to point that out.
Follow-up? That is a great question, and that's a conversation that we literally have almost daily in our office. We're all very concerned with that, and we've run into it in a variety of different research projects. I can give you one example, well, I can give you a bunch of examples. Two that are very relevant to this are the point-in-time count. I was involved in that a couple of years ago, and as a researcher, it was infuriating on one level to have to tear all that information up about the particular points geographically, especially as a mapper, right? That's what I do. I helped them map in order to find the people for the point-in-time count, and then we destroyed the information afterwards. And I was internally very happy about that, but also, like I said, just infuriated at destroying data and not, you know what I mean? So that struggle is there. And then the other thing I was going to mention is in a website that we also have there, IMS, called Neighborhood Pulse, I put together a story in partnership with one of our researchers, Uma Krishnan, who now works for the city of Portland. And the story is about the Somali population in Portland. And we had many back and forth conversations with their representatives, the people who ostensibly represented the groups that wanted to do this story with us, with that specific discussion about, do you want to be mapped, and how should we protect this information? Like, how much do you want out there? President Trump had just been elected, and that really set off these conversations. And they decided they would rather be counted. They would rather be out, this is who we are, this is how many we are, so that they were participating in that, in that great social experiment of getting money. Essentially, they were trying to get funds like everybody else to build community centers and things like that. But as long as the city or the county or whoever only thought there were 2,000 of them rather than 10,000, they weren't getting the kind of allocation that they needed to do the things they needed for their kids. So we have this conversation. We struggle with that question all the time. And all the GRAs and research students that come in and work with us struggle with that as well. Just so you know, it's not a new question for us either. So thank you.
So I'm coming in a little bit new, learning about the census in terms of the city side. I work for the city of Vancouver. I'm just wondering if the question of race was completely removed, how would that impact how we get funds and allocate funds?
I don't know.
Or, I mean,
Yeah.
would it? Or would it not?
In terms of the removal of race?
Yeah.
And
that was
so-
my question.
Yeah, so I believe the race or the population count by race is actually in the PL file. So that's one of the files that is where the census is legally required to produce for apportionment. But to your question, yeah, what if that was taken out? Yeah, I mean, it would definitely affect some. It could affect multiple things. One is in terms of representation. So in terms of like Apano, if we have someone from here from Apano, anybody? Okay, right. So for Apano, right, like when you're applying for a grant or you're applying for a federal grant, one of the things that they need to know is not just the total population of your area, but like the area or the population of interest. And so the Asian American and Pacific Islander population. And even though we may be only looking at 2010 or 2020 data, the thing to remember is that all intercental estimates, so like 2011, 2018, where we're at now, that was based off of the relationships and the denominator that was in 2010. And so even though this happens only every 10 years, like quite literally all of social science estimates, all of our estimates are based off of the decennial census. And so if we don't get that population count by race, that means we can't get all these other estimates by race, like median or these other estimates by race, like median household income, poverty. All of those become much more subject to scrutiny, and they become less reliable. And so yes, it matters for apportionment, but it also matters for research in general.
This is just a curious question of why you decided to use race like black alone rather than in combination with.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. One of the reasons is because of the way race is operationalized in the census, and so you'll notice that for a lot of these things we'll see white alone, not Hispanic, black alone, not Hispanic, everything. And the reason we do that is because that's the only way to get to 100%. To like when you add it up, it adds up the total population without overcounting anybody or missing anybody. So if you were to do black alone or in combination, and you sum that up for all the races, not only would you be excluding Hispanics, but the total but the sum of that would exceed the total population because you're double counting people. Right now, obviously, there are issues when you're looking at black alone, not Hispanic, when 37% of black Oregonians checked another box other than black. So yeah, you're potentially excluding a lot of populations, but at this point, depending on no method is perfect when you're looking at this. And for the purposes of this map, we wanted to make sure that the estimates or the subgroups added up to the total pop.
Is it all right if I just speak?
Oh yeah, just go for it. We do need you.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Can you speak to just creating the map and the colors used for the HardtoCount? I've seen a few hard-to-count maps, and I'm disappointed to see that the hard-to-count populations are indicated by the red color.
Yes.
In particular, when we sort of unpack that history and understand that it has to do with being highly mobile or not being, like being excluded from civic activities. And so it doesn't seem, if anything, it should be green. That's where the money is.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, it is problematic, absolutely. This is essentially a first pass based on the Oregon version of this map. So we went strictly with their symbology. But yeah, I struggle with that as well, because part of me says the stoplight is actually useful for calling attention, but at the same time, I understand. That's something that we're going to continue sort of field testing, and that kind of feedback actually helps a lot. So if you have any more specific reasoning for that, I'd be glad to hear it maybe afterwards, and I will take that into consideration, absolutely. But that is foundational, and I appreciate you calling that out, even though we'd already sort of thought about redoing that.
In addition to our question, the only political parties I know in America are red and blue.
Yeah.
That's Democrats and Republicans. So I was just wondering the same thing too. Like,
Those are all Republican era. No.
yeah.
Another good point. Absolutely.
Yeah, party-wise.
Red becomes a very dangerous color to use these days, and you can blame it on me. I defaulted to an existing map. So.
Yeah, he broke the cardinal rule for cartography. You never use blue or red unless you're doing a political map. You don't do red and green because we're colorblind. There's really if we want to go deep into it, like there's only like maybe 5 color ramps that you could use for this map, but we of the time constraints that we had, like we did not invest the time and resources into that more than anything. So.
You're gonna throw me under the bus.
I mean, you made the map. Kevin? No.
So this isn't directly related to Oregon, but when you were showing the national maps at the county level,
Yep.
northern Wisconsin was something that stood out. Maybe not necessarily on that map, but the other one.
Oh, sorry. Too many of these.
And do you know what was going on up there, or why that particular area was showing up
I
differently?
just talked to somebody about that. I am not entirely sure. When we click on this, I don't know if this data was like marked out because of confidentiality or something.
I think that might be an area that uses a different enumeration.
Yeah, that sounds right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so one of the different, so one issue, this happens in rural places that was brought up in previous panels, is that if you have a PO box, right, in 2010, the census wouldn't deliver mail to a PO box, which is problematic if you're in a rural area where like literally 90% of households have a PO box. And so that requires more interaction and conversation with the census to get those forms out. That would be like a special case that deviates from the normal process of enumeration. I'm not sure if that's one of the reasons why this is grayed out, because it's not consistent methodologies of how the other estimates were derived.
We've got a few of those in Oregon as well.
Well, if nobody has any other questions about HardtoCount, or just questions in general, like just go for, we have time, or if people want to go see another one, they can. Like, yeah, it's not. You won't hurt my feelings. Like, it's fine.
All right. Please feel free to stop me. I have a question about, so we know that some areas, so I'm actually working in Fairview and Wood Village, and when we pull them up on the map, you can see that they had a pretty low response rate in Oregon. They had the 3rd lowest response rate at, I think, 63.1 or 61.3%.
That's pretty low.
So as I work in those communities, something I wonder about is, we know that they had a low mail response rate. We know that probably some people weren't counted. Can we get estimates, like about how many people weren't counted, or, I don't know what I'm exactly trying to say, but we know there's a question mark, and do you guys have like tools to kind of get at that?
Are you referring to an undercount or a hard to count?
So there was not an official undercount, which I
Correct.
understand to be like a process, right?
Yes.
We would, as if I'm with the city, so I would say, hey, I think there was an official, or I think there was an undercount in 2020,
Yes.
and I go through an official process
Yes.
where a determination is made, right, whether it was undercounted or not.
Yeah.
That didn't happen in 2010.
Mhm.
But because of I just wonder, like, what am I trying to say?
Yeah, I mean-
How come we have to count people? I know that's in the Constitution, but we know that some people don't get counted.
Mhm.
So why can't we just count them anyways? Like, without having to go through the census process? That's a way bigger question.
Yeah,
I don't know
I
what
mean,
I'm trying to say.
yeah,
We
I-
have the data. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things is, I think it's a good question, especially with big data, with a lot of administrative records and sources out there, that like, I'm sure as time passes on, one of the questions that will come up with the census is like, well, this like multi-billion-dollar process, is it really worth it when we have administrative records that we could just join? I would say that there are two issues to that. One is that administrative records don't have all of the information that the census is going to ask for, at least not like all of them in one administrative record. So it may have your age, it may have your sex, but it may not have your race, or it may not have your address of location. Again, like it's literally written into law that there needs to be an actual enumeration. I think one of the challenges with an undercount, like you said, like if there was an undercount in 2010, you can actually, PRC has actually done this in the past where a city believed that their census count was too low, and we've actually conducted another census for them. And based off those results, if that turns out to be higher than the actual census population, I believe there's some sort of process for amending it or changing the official count.
Thank you. One of the things that I wanted to find out from being here today is how will you deal with populations that, one, are moving, and two, whose nationality and presence is not always there? We have maybe hundreds of Mexican nationals, not only Mexicans, there's people from Thailand, people from Western Europe who work here with visas, but that are here present in the country, although they may not ever have a nationality.
Sure.
So in talking about Troutdale, I've done work for cities there as a community engagement liaison, and I find it so difficult to find at least a gathering place. You know, the communities, the places for social gathering are not really there. Maybe only the library, and you can tell for sure. There's spaces to walk that are huge, and not a lot of engagement into places where you can be safe. So, you know, I don't know if this is the forum to ask for that, you know, as best ways to try to count those people. But I know that these are important populations, because many times you have children, you have mothers of sometimes children that are unborn that should be counting, because this people, you know, these children, you know, again, as we go south, you know, towards Salem and Woodburn, we have a ton of people living in camps, and so in egg farms and things like that. And so how do we count not just the people that we have today, but the ones that will be here, you know, 10 years and over?
Oh, okay. Okay, I think that final, your last statement, now I have to pivot. So the census, regardless of one's nationality, will count you if you are reside in Oregon on April 1st. So if you are even a temporary worker, I know there's a bunch of temporary workers, I think in northern Lake County, that, you know, they may only be here for 4 or 5 months, but if they're here on April 1st, they get counted their population. The other thing that I would say is I'm not for, in terms of making sure that vulnerable populations get counted, one of them is particularly around transitory locations. One of the things that our center did is creating an statewide inventory of transitory locations across Oregon. And so by transitory locations, that includes camps, includes hotels, motels that people actually, that's their primary residence. Obviously, that inventory, I can say, objectively speaking, is not complete. It's not a complete list, but it's because we've never had one in Oregon before. And so we created one, and ideally we hope to build on that in the future to improve the outreach. But again, like in terms of like for cancer transitory locations, that's like less. As researchers, we can't do that. That's really on the ground work. That's why it's really important to get boots on the ground and get trusted community partners to engage and identify those areas without stepping over and violating some ethical or confidential information. In terms of understanding the number of populations in the future, like future populations, that's actually my job. So I produce the population forecasts for the counties and the cities, so that for planning reasons. It's more difficult to do it by race. So I know there's a lot of talk about creating projections by race for across the race groups. It's problematic for a few reasons. One is how I told you about how race is a very complicated construct to measure, and it may not necessarily align with what we assume to see or what we see on the ground. So again, like for blacks, if you just do black alone, not Hispanic, you're isolating the 37% of African Americans who checked another race. And so for race in particular, it's difficult to forecast because of the changing definition and the changing way that people report their race.
Follow up real quick. That's one of the reasons I would say your question about safe spaces really, the best one that I think we can advocate for right now is the libraries, because libraries are long established. They're pretty much considered safe spaces across the board by everyone. And they don't, correct me if I'm wrong, they don't seem to be places that are targeted at this point, which means that it's probably continuing to be a safe space into the 2020 census. Some of my work is around establishing libraries as further centers of education and things like that, and everything I've seen so far says take your folks to the library, get them counted. Don't expect the government to find some other safe space, because at this point it's not in the works, and it's not there's not enough time, I think.
Hello, Vivian Bide reporting for the Pacific Sentinel. Most of the research that's been presented today regarding hard-to-count populations, particularly unhoused populations, focuses on engagement with service providers. What is your approach to getting an accurate or near accurate count of those who are not actively engaging with services?
I see. Yeah. So is this like a place specific, like if it's a city or a county that doesn't have said services, or is this more?
This is more about counting the population that, for whatever reason, is not engaging with the service partners that you would normally reach out to.
Yeah.
Statewide.
Yeah, that's a question that is not in my. I don't have the expertise to answer that question, unfortunately. I would say that the way that that's done, would you, if you don't group community members or community organizations or trusted neighborhood partners in that group, then that would be the first place that the census or the city would point to into identifying the location of camps or location of these transient locations to identify where they are. There's really not a good answer if you're not engaged in those services. I think the census uses a different enumeration technique that's actually going to be talked about hopefully in the next session. I don't think it was this session. that they'll go over it. I think if you were to attend that session, the person who is up here answering would be able to answer a question more effectively.
Bit of a follow-up question. This may also be outside your purview. To my knowledge, the 2020 census test forms and even the 2010 census forms did not include an option for the unhoused. How are these figures actually reported, considering there's no fitting answer for this population?
That's a great question. Actually, I think Mark could probably answer that question because he went over that in the previous panel. So, Mark, do you wanna take a swing?
Didn't you still have like 2 minutes left on
Yeah.
your presentation? So.
Can you ask the question again? Because I came in just as you were.
All right. This particular question is, given that there is no option to just answer unhoused on the census forms, how are we actually taking count of unhoused individuals, and how are they being classified, considering there's mandatory reporting on all questions?
Mm-hmm. So I'm going to actually go do a deep dive a couple minutes here in the next presentation. But so they're enumerated during our service-based enumeration operation. So it's it's very similar to the point-in-time count, that the state does. And then the data from that count is included in a sort of subcategory of the group quarters counts that you'll see, that you can see, I don't know if you went over this, but on the American Community Survey, for example, or the census data as well. I guess it'd be more decennial census, but you can go on and see they're sort of included under a group for folks that were enumerated in a emergency or a transitional shelter, for example, and then they're otherwise included in a group of like folks who are living outdoors and enumerated during targeted non-shelter outdoor locations, that operation. So the decennial census itself doesn't really provide a good figure for people experiencing homelessness because, as you were saying, there's no information on the form that would really capture that. Hoping this is helping to answer your question a little bit, but essentially that information is included under the group quarters breakdown in the census. Does that help? Because of course the actual homeless enumeration and the actual counts of people experiencing homelessness comes from housing and urban development. That's the official count of people experiencing homelessness in the U.S.
Sure. Thank you. I'll likely have follow-up questions.
Sure,
during
yeah.
your
Yeah,
presentation.
want this back?
No.
Okay.
Anybody else? Okay, thank you, everyone.